Trust in the mainstream media is at a 50-year low in the United States, 8 points lower in the United Kingdom, and worldwide, out of the various institutions, the media comes bottom in trust. One of the reasons people will give is that the mainstream media lies, which it does. Actually, it'd be more accurate to say it lies sometimes. By volume of output, probably just 5% of the time. Most stories tell you a thing happened, and yes, indeed, that thing did happen. It's just that the relative political and cultural importance of the times when it does lie is a lot more than 5%. Shouldn't be a surprise that it's when issues are at the most important, when journalists and editors are most inclined to carefully tailor the words they use to try to have the impact that they would wish to have. In this video, we're going to do the quickest of canters through the types of content where the mainstream media most often lies. Sometimes with malicious intent, sometimes with misplaced benign intent, sometimes just because of the nature of the media and how it makes money. But always in ways that you can learn to spot, so you can get the benefit of informing your world with some of the high-quality journalism that is out there, the 95%, without falling for any of the lies and nonsense on the crucially important 5%. So let's jump straight in. In summary, there's some overlap in these, but broadly speaking, the mainstream media lies by selection, by omission, by misrepresentation, by campaigning, by sensationalizing, by speculation, by ventriloquism, by distortion, by false equivalence, by hidden conflicts of interest, by chasing fame and headlines, by fake sources. Apart from that, they're solid. First of all then, by selection, the lying that doesn't involve lying per se. In principle, newspapers and websites should clearly distinguish between what's news, which should be described in a factual way without bias, and what is commentary, which can be as biased as you want because it's clearly marked as opinion. The fact is, you could even succeed at that, although not many do, while still producing a misleading impression of the world. And that's what happens with selection bias. So on UK news, I routinely scan lots of different sources. The most politically biased amongst them are The Guardian on the left and The Telegraph on the right. They are often biased in a number of different ways, but whenever you get political stories, the key distinction is the choice of what to cover. If electric vehicles catching fire or blowing up is your thing, The Telegraph has you covered. If, on the other hand, record numbers of electric vehicles being sold in the UK in 2024 and other similar positive reports on their growth in the market, if that's what you want, well, you've got The Guardian. If you want to read about how it was cold and still last week, meaning that the country needed lots of power and wasn't getting any from wind power, then The Telegraph. If alternatively you want to be notified when windy conditions have meant that a higher percentage of power from the grid came from renewables than ever before, then The Guardian. None of these stories usually are lies. Nevertheless, if you only read The Telegraph, you get a version of reality that suggests that only bad things are happening as a result of what they describe as net zero madness. If you only read The Guardian, you get a version of reality that suggests that only wonderful things happen from exactly the same processes. So, without technically lying, they present a version of reality that is demonstrably false, that ignores trade-offs, pretends no problems can be solved, or alternatively, that no problems exist. Other examples of this sort of selection in the US, you can particularly see it with left-leaning media who will highlight stories about white police killing a black civilian. Very little profile given when the racial profile is the other way round. One of them is taken as newsworthy because it fits a narrative, the other doesn't exist. According to Ground News, at the point of shooting this video, the story the UK left-wing media is most ignoring is Nigel Farage's Reform UK Party trailing Labour by just 1 point in the opinion polls. The one that the right-wing media are mostly ignoring is that a Syrian man was crushed to death attempting to cross the English Channel on a small boat. You also see it in what media organisations may choose to fact-check and what they will simply let slide. And that's before you even deal with whether the fact-checks are any good or not, which of course sometimes they're really not. Second category, lies by omission. This is where certain facts are considered to be politically sensitive, so they just get dropped from the story. A typical example of this will be where the racial or other identity is omitted from a story, and you read the story, and you immediately get the sense, there's something I'm not being told here? A recent example of this was when the BBC was found to have breached its accuracy rules on a report about a woman cat killer, Scarlett Blake, which failed to disclose that Blake was a trans woman who was sent to a men's prison. At the moment, you will particularly find racial identity and particularly immigration status as treated as similarly sensitive. Now, of course, these things are genuinely sensitive. Of course, in the UK, we had riots after false rumours about the immigration status of the murderer of girls in Southport. Nevertheless, the truth will out, and people are more angry when they feel the facts have been attempted to be covered up. While, yes, there are certain activist groups who jump onto such things, the majority of the population are entirely able to take the facts as they actually are. This was a point I recently saw being made by Alexei Navalny in his posthumously published book Patriot, prompted by the impact of Chernobyl. The standard and completely moronic response of the Soviet and subsequently of the Russian authorities to any crisis is to decide that it is in the interest of the population that they should be lied to endlessly. Otherwise, the reasoning goes, people are sure to run out of their homes, rush around in a state of anarchy, set buildings on fire and kill each other. Now, okay, the Western media is still a long way behind the Russians on this, if you want to gather some faint praise. But when it takes upon itself the role of nanny, protecting us from ourselves, it makes itself unreliable and untrusted, and that makes things worse, and ironically gives more credence to the people who might be inclined to behave badly as a result. 3. Misrepresentation. One example I would give of this would be opinion pieces masquerading as news. I covered one example of this a while ago, a BBC so-called news story, which gave the impression that a group of experts had told the Prime Minister, then Boris Johnson, that his techno-optimistic approach to climate change was flawed. This was in advance of a major speech Johnson was going to give on the subject, and when you looked at it, it became clear that no such communication had happened at all. The journalist had simply contacted a few of his NGO buddies who agreed with his perspective and gave him a bunch of quotes to say so, and that could be dressed up as a news story. But really, it was an opinion piece by the journalist, masquerading as news. It's a form of campaigning. I did say there are a number of overlaps, but let's deal separately then with campaigning. There are certain issues where the media decides that they are so self-evidently right that they are to be campaigned for on a routine basis, often under the guise of news stories. During COVID-19, some of the government's programmes and the debates around COVID origins and lockdowns efficacy came into this category. Climate change and the suggested policies to deal with it also do, of course. This tends to lead them to start inserting words into headlines and lead sentences to make sure that you're clear about what you are supposed to think. For example, early in the COVID pandemic, a number of left-leaning papers covered headlines such as this one: Tom Cotton, Senator Tom Cotton, keeps repeating a coronavirus conspiracy theory that was already debunked. It includes quotes from various experts disputing a claim that the virus might have been bioengineered, even though Tom Cotton didn't suggest that it had been. This report was eventually corrected, along with the following notice. Earlier versions of this story and its headline inaccurately characterized comments by Senator Tom Cotton regarding the origins of the coronavirus. The term debunked and the post's use of conspiracy theory have been removed because then, as now, there was no determination about the origins of the virus. That notice at least reflects the media's sufficient commitment to standards to be self-reflective well after the event. But for those of us reading today's news, that is of minimal consolation. On climate, that campaigning can take the form of selectively reporting research that flags up worst-case scenarios, being relatively quiet about anything that goes the other way, and taking as read that certain policy proposals, such as reducing meat consumption or flying, are unquestionably the only response conceivable in line with the science, conflating science with policy. Of course, it doesn't even need to be said that you get campaigning during elections. The failure of the American media to be remotely curious about Joe Biden's clearly obvious cognitive decline was one such factor. The blanket ignoring of the Hunter Biden laptop story, another one. And the various times where Donald Trump's admittedly garbled words were misrepresented or given the worst possible interpretation by the left, or indeed when he spoke nonsense and that was disregarded by the right. So we have that as a very, very regular factor. Those were amongst the highest profile political partisan lies that did the most to destroy the reputation of the media as sources you could trust. I get the sense that some of them have learned the lesson, but then that's what every cheating husband will say, so decide for yourself how much you're buying that. A more general way that the media lies, sensationalizing. Now, this isn't new. It isn't necessarily malicious. It's just how the media has always worked. It means they report the unusual. They make it sound as bad as possible because that's what sells newspapers, or in the modern era generates clicks that wins advertising revenue. If it bleeds, it leads, goes the old saying. And in so doing, it persuades the public that crime is worse than it is, the world is in a terrible state with poverty and war everywhere, ecological disasters wherever you look. No wonder a lot of people despair of the future, and also that a lot of others just decide to avoid the news altogether. As a species, we assume that whatever we see the most is important, and that means that the media, by dint of its business model, puts the lie in our head that the worst things are really common, and boringly good things, those things almost never happen. That is exacerbated by the next category, speculation. What percentage of headlines do you see that have the words could, might, or is predicted in them? In constant news cycles, and with news refusing to happen as instantly as such cycles require, a significant amount of news is made up of speculation. Generally, the speculation is dramatized for the sake of those clicks, remember. Disaster could happen. I mean, it probably won't. My rule is to remember that whenever you see a headline with the fact that something could happen, you should find that you can add the word not after it, and it will almost certainly be equally true as a statement. Next, ventriloquism. This comes to the practice of quoting partisan players as though they were impartial experts or members of the public. So, for example, the BBC has been caught a number of times quoting reportedly independent experts who turned out to be Labour Party activists. Were they always aware of this when it happened? Well, they're supposed to check, so if they weren't, they really should have been. Those are key areas where the media sometimes, annoyingly when it most matters, lies to you. There are a few other issues we could go into. Selective quoting to give a misleading sense of a weight of opinion, hidden conflicts of interest, using gotcha journalism to chase fame and notoriety, inventing quotes from anonymous sources, and just generally political journalists living in an echo chamber of their own, where they have their own priorities and their own cynicisms and their own motivations. But those are the main ones. I would add an important caveat at this point. Lots of people will look at all of that and use it to dismiss all journalism, all mainstream media, and to cut off any exposure they have to it on a day-to-day basis. Cynicism rather than skepticism. The problem is that there is still outstanding journalism, like that by journalist Andrew Norfolk, who first exposed the scandal of the grooming gangs in the UK in the Times of London back in 2013. Professional journalists go into places and get stories that would otherwise remain out of sight. They take risks to do so. Some of them die to do so. They talk to the politicians, they talk to the police, all the various actors. The best of them use that access to get real insight into what's going on out of sight. Social media commentators and influencers comment, occasionally creatively reinterpret stuff, but the majority of what they are discussing is, after all, what originated via the mainstream media, even if some of them like to pretend otherwise. Because, yes, people in the new media can be lying to you as well, especially because the algorithms provide them with many of the same incentives that the standard media model does. So take the content of this video as a primer to make yourself more savvy to the failings of the media at its worst. I just recommend you don't give in to the temptations to use it to indulge blanket cynicism, because you'll be cutting yourself off from an important source of information, putting yourself into the mindset of the cult, which prohibits its members from exposure to contacts other than those approved by the cult membership. And there's a reason why they do that, and it's not for the benefit of the members. The trick is to be alert to the failings, to notice them when you see them, and just be that extra bit diligent to check to see if the real story is different to the one being presented to you. Now, this channel does not chase the algorithm, not beyond trying to make accurate titles sound kind of interesting. So if this video has been useful or interesting to you, consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can do that at patreon.com/Mallen Baker. If you're not subscribed yet, well, you know what to do. Did I miss anything in my list of how the news media lies to you that you think I should have included? Let me know in the comments below.